Hey, Glenn, good to see you again.
Yes, it's been a while, actually, I think.
Yes, it has. And I know both has happened and lots has happened in both of our lives since then. But today we're just getting together and kind of sharing thoughts that have been going back and forth between us by email and going on in our own heads. And so we don't have a particular topic, although you did want to talk about truth and especially Nima Arkani Hamed's perspective on truth. And I want to talk about reality. And since I think they line up, maybe that'll make a good topic.
Actually, I'd say they're the same thing.
Yeah, that's
Reality and
exactly the
capital T
conclusion.
truth are, yeah.
Yeah, that's the conclusion I've come to. So let's get started. What were your thoughts about Nima Arkani Hamed's
Well,
perspective on truth?
it's a long pathway, and it started with our emails regarding Jordan Peterson and some of the attitudes or opinions people in the Christian church have towards him, that he's not really a Christian. They expect him to say the right words. And so I think we had sorry, email conversation on that, which I never finished. I always wanted to complete. And then I think out of that, you sent me that video of Jordan Peterson talking about truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that dovetailed really nicely with the email. And then I realized if you take a look at why the truth is so important, and you had a conversation with Michael, I guess, last week, where he was talking about scientific truth and the need, but that's part of a bigger issue of why the truth is important to begin with. And if you go from there, you get to, this is the pathway my Aspie brain went through. You look at Jordan Peterson, talk about how important the truth is, because you can't be creative. No individual can be truly creative if they're not tied to the truth. And then I looked at Nima Arkani Hamed's comments on that original video about, if to do physics, you have to believe that there's some kind of capital T truth, some objective reality out there, which is maybe not knowable, but at least approachable by us mere humans, finite, yeah. And so Nima points out is that if you want to approach the truth, there's certain disciplines, lifestyle disciplines that a person has to take on if they want to approach the truth. And that starts to look a little bit like a personal moral code. And then another jump was to individual that Michael led me to, and that's Cesar Hidalgo. Mm-hmm. He's got a nice one on the Google Talks, and he wrote a book which I was so inspired I actually bought and read, Why Information Grows. And he's an economist, so his main arguments are in the areas of economy, but he starts out with talking about computational systems at the level that is, he could be quoting me or I could be quoting him word for word in some cases.
That's what I thought.
So I got really excited. But Cesar Hidalgo is talking about, at the economic level, what makes some societies or cultures more thrive economically, wealth-wise, more than others. And he looks at computation, and an individual is only capable of so much thinking or creativeness for society or any creative effort to move forward. It has to become a cooperative effort, and some people would refer to this as the collective consciousness. That's kind of a woo-woo concept for some, but when you look at it in terms of economics, it becomes a very hard, real thing that you can look at, that the economic growth for society depends on the trust networks that can develop in society. So societies where the family or the clan is the center of trust, you're only going to see certain industries, certain economic developments, manufacturing, endeavors will be limited by the size of the collective brain or the distributed intelligence that that social network can embody. And so the societies that have the greater trust network between people tend to be the ones that are more successful economically. And that's, you know, it's pretty solid fact whether people like it or not. And I got thinking that if a society as a whole wants to pursue truth, in the sense that, you know, the scientists pursuing capital T truth, then society as a whole has to accept that same kind of discipline on itself that an individual would if they want to pursue the truth. So it doesn't, when a lot of discussions on consciousness neglect the collective nature of our humanity. That I don't do electronics by myself. You can't do art by yourself. Mm-hmm. There has to be a whole industry of paints and people who make this stuff. Society as a whole has to value what you do as a creative effort to make it worth. So your effort is the end result of a collective consciousness, which is somehow working together, each one of us unconscious of the bigger part. So I realized if you start with the truth, you go up through Nima and realize that a certain discipline has to be imposed on you if you want to pursue the truth. Take that notion and apply it to societies or cultures as a whole. As you as a people want to choose to follow the truth, look for something transcendent, society has to take on some kind of rules. And I realized if you do that, you get the 10 Commandments. So, and now it begs the question, if you can get to something that looks like the 10 Commandments without having to go through scripture, that's telling me there's something important there that we need to pay attention to. And then I step back and then I do the typical physics thing is like, well, if there's a pattern, what's underneath it? So we have the 10 Commandments. You know, the first few are the vertical, our relationship with God, or the transcendent, and the rest are the horizontal side, our relationship with our fellow man. You ask yourself, what kind of society does that set of rules create? And it enables a society that can pursue the transcendent. And so that's how I'm looking at it. Of all of the possible rules that you could come up with, you know, 5 to 10 or 8, why has the 10 Commandments somehow been around for 3,000 plus years? Mm-hmm. There must be something important in that set that is telling us humans that we should be paying attention to something more. And even other religious traditions have equivalent statements. So I don't know, I'll just throw it out there. I'm just asking, I'm not making,
yeah.
You know.
Well, okay, so let me start with the 10 Commandments thing. Yes, of course, the 10 Commandments arose before scripture because there was no scripture when the 10 Commandments arose. And then later it was written down and then we had scripture, right, to go and look at it. And those same ideas arose in other societies as well. Not exactly the same, but I mean, they were refined by the Hebrew community, or they were refined through Moses's communication with God. And so that's what we have a record of, are the ones that were written down then. But what the 10 Commandments tell us, I think, is what is the proper way to relate to reality. Okay, because reality has a shape. And if we are correct that capital T truth and reality are the same thing, then reality is a person. And Jordan Peterson has this thing, he says that reality is the phenomena that emerge as a consequence of ongoing behavior. But I think he's a little bit wrong, because I think this is what I'd like to say. I put this into words. I'm just working on it. Okay. We are able to align with reality or draw close in relationship through the phenomena that emerge as a consequence of ongoing behavior. So the way that we draw closer to truth, and there's nothing wrong with the scientific method, because that is a way of drawing closer to the truth. You posit something, you try it out, you see what happens. And that's exactly what happens in our lives whenever we try something new in our lives. Either it works or it doesn't work, right? I mean, that's a simple thing. It's not magic. It's not some special thing that scientists came up with. That's just the way we live. When we face a really negative consequence, we know that the thing that we tried was not appropriate in one way or another. And so we have to change course. So reality is a guide to us for proper behavior. And over time, it doesn't surprise me at all that reality being that guide would ultimately result in a set of 10 rules, laws, principles that would guide people, because those are very broad laws, right? They're not like some little specific thing, like you put the nail in this spot. Within those laws, you have a lot of room and a lot of flexibility. So when I think about, I told you I'm trying to get my ideas put together because I'm supposed to talk about this on the Wisdom Path Colloquium. The elements and principles of design are that kind of a set of principles that interact with each other and have a lot of room from one side to the other, and create multiple potentialities with a lot of flexibility. But still, you have to adhere to those elements and principles, or adhering to those elements and principles produces a work that is enticing to the viewer. So it aligns with reality in that sense, that it actually, Jordan Peterson would use the word, it works, but then people will accuse him of being a pragmatist. So, but there is a sense in which everything we do either works or doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, we suffer negative consequences. So one of the things that we learn in aligning with reality, you mentioned Cesar Hidalgo. So from an economic standpoint, one of the big points of economics world is opportunity cost. If I do this, I can't do that. Not at the same time anyway, right? And so you're always making choices. And the other thing that is so true about the economics world, at least like from the Adam Smith perspective, that enlightened self-interest is what produces this web of distributed cognition that allows us to have larger enterprises where we can develop more, right?
That's a very Christian notion that you just said. And I think that's my criticism of people like Sam Harris and others who think you can develop a system of morality starting from rational principles alone, is because they unconsciously assume that that's what a person would want to do. And history says no. I think the historian Tom Holland, that was his big issue these days, is after studying the Greek and the Roman worlds, classic worlds, he realized that Western culture is Christian, Judeo-Christian, not Greek or Roman. So we take the 10 Commandments as like, well, why would you want to do anything else? But if you go back 2,000 years, that was the exception. That was the rare exception. The Romans thought the Jews and the Christians were crazy for believing that sort of stuff. So that's,
well, so maybe what it is then is that from the one side, to us as Christians, it may look like the 10 Commandments are self-evidently the best way to live, but historically, and of course we know, I mean, these things get so tangled up. We know that actions, that the good are not always rewarded for their goodness, and that many times evil people succeed and prosper. We know that to be a fact, right? But that's because we're looking at the moment and not looking at the historical context, not looking at the long view. I ran into a verse this morning that I had never really noticed before, that David lived out the purpose God had for him. It's something like that.
Mhm.
And so we don't know what that means. David living out the purpose God had for him was a tumultuous journey with lots of ups and downs and mistakes and triumphs and everything all mixed up together.
Mhm.
But what David was living out the purpose God had for him. So even within every life, there is a lot of flexibility for many different things going on at one time.
Mhm.
But what you brought up about the Christian view makes a whole lot of sense, because I don't like to use the word capitalism. I'd rather use the word free market.
Mhm.
But that really only works in a society where morality is prized, where
Yes.
enlightened self-interest is based on an ethic of sacrifice and work ethic and willingness to serve other people and all of that, goodness of heart. It really only
Yeah.
works in that kind of, although to a certain extent, capitalism is a little bit self-correcting, because if I want to sell what I have to somebody else, I have to put it at a price that they'll pay,
Mhm.
and they have to pay me what I want. And so there's a little bit of self-correction there, but there's still a lot of room for evildoers to get the upper hand for a while.
Mhm.
But over time, not so much, right?
Yeah, I think that's the misunderstanding, that capitalism by itself is not the answer. But what capitalism does is allow a distributed intelligence
Mm-hmm.
in society to take form, in which you get an honest economy.
Yeah.
But you have to have people who are loyal to the truth, loyal to the transcendent. That low trust societies, the one that are clans or family oriented,
Mm-hmm.
that's a world where you don't trust your neighbor. You're always trying to get something over on them, take stuff. Your status comes from how much you can take from other people, or how much you can make other people bend to your will. That's the typical of the barbarian world of more ancient times. And in those worlds, the collective consciousness of the community had a moral code, and it reflected that notion of taking, of being able to dominate others. And in those worlds, wealth was not created by making new stuff. Wealth was stolen, taken from other people. And I think that's one of the reflections that you see in our societies. We see wealth as something that's created by our individual or cooperative efforts. And it's not a fixed pie where this, if I get more, you get less. And that's a common way of looking at things now.
Mm-hmm.
The creative world, there's always more, because we can always make more. There's plenty of ingredients to make more pie.
Well, and I also want to touch on this thing, what you talked about, trust, or a trust network. Lately, whenever I've been reading the Bible, I always check when the word believe comes up, what is the Greek? And almost every time the Greek is trust.
Mhm.
It's not believe. It's either the word for to be trusted, or to trust Christ, or to trust the truth, or that Christ is to be trusted. It's
Mhm.
always this word trust. And trust is active. It's not like belief can be a very passive thing just up in your head, right?
Yeah.
So I think that the Bible translators did us a real disservice when they switched out belief and trust as being comparative, because a belief network, Twitter is a belief network. There's people fighting
Oh
on
yeah.
beliefs on all sides, right? But it's completely useless. It produces nothing. But a trust network of individuals can build a civilization. I mean, the US is a civilization built on trust.
Yeah. So yeah, trust has an element of action to it.
Yeah.
I trust that the stairs are not going to collapse under me. But believing I could just sit at the top and believe whatever I want.
So when I trust Christ, and since the truth and reality are the same thing, Christ is reality. When I trust him, I'm trusting that reality is good. Mm-hmm. Right? People say, oh, reality hit me, or I got hit upside the head with a 2x4. What that really means is a loving Lord revealed to us the truth of our actions and showed us a better way. Mm-hmm. And that's an act of love. So reality is also love. So love, reality, truth, Christ, they all mm-hmm. inhabit the same space. That's the way it looks to me.
Yeah, I'd say, well, yeah, I need the two before a lot in my life. Sometimes
so then the shape of reality, if that's the case, then the nature of reality, well, the character of reality is goodness, truth, and beauty. Mm-hmm. Right? The nature of reality is love, and the character of reality is goodness, truth, and
that's how we know the transcendent is. It's funny, the transcendent is above us, but yet we feel it at the emotional level down below the intellect. Mm-hmm. And so I think I've often wondered if that's why some people are very uncomfortable with people like me who take a more intellectual view of the transcendent, because they sense it emotionally. And when I start talking more intellectual, they feel like I'm leaving them behind. And I understand that, but yeah, you're right. We use beauty and all of that. We're sensing the transcendent emotionally at some level. Mm-hmm. And that's how downward causation, if you want to play the strong emergence game, that's how it manifests itself in the downward layers.
Well, so let's think about this a minute. So, oh gosh, I had this picture in my head.
Well, I could take off on a different
angle. Just vanished. But a second ago, you said something that made that picture appear. But go ahead, keep talking. It'll come back.
Well, on the science question.
Well, that was it. Was the science thing, yeah.
Well, one of the things that drives the politics is that people are afraid that if the truth comes out, that people will make the wrong decisions. So then they feel that at the political level, they need to lie and cover up and hide information, because heaven knows, the Trump voter might actually be right. But what they're saying is they don't trust the truth. Once you cross that line where you think the lie is good for everybody, I need to lie because it's for the best interest of everybody. What you just said is you don't trust the truth anymore. Mm-hmm. And somehow that ties into what you've been talking about, is that part of trust is letting go. Okay, I'm worried, but I'm going to trust that if I'm honest about the scientific data, that people will make the right decisions. And at a certain level, that trust in science is gone. So in a funny way, the people who keep talking about science, trust the science, are the ones who trust it the least.
Well, and the really sad thing is that it's come from both directions. There's a large, significant portion of the Christian community that's afraid to look at the science because they're afraid they'll see something there that damages their belief. Mm-hmm. And then the other side that's trying to control the narrative and change everybody into little bots. Mm-hmm. They're trying to control the truth by their lies about this or that, or not showing us the scientific evidence because they're afraid of. I mean, there's so many cases where that's the case, and that all gets into the issue of peer review and how peer review is preventing actual breakthroughs in science and so forth. But maybe before we go down that road, I want to just stick with this paradigm that we're trying to draw here. You talked about science. If we look through the lens of, say, scientism, where science is all there is, then it seems to me what you're getting is only the map. You're only getting the set of rules. But an actual attempt to find the truth, like what Nima Arkani Hamed is talking about, that falls over more into the territory of relationship, not the map, but the territory itself, or trying to really know, trying to live in the territory, abide in the territory. So I think when Christ says, abide in me, what he's really saying is, be willing to live in reality. Because if I avoid reality because I'm afraid of what will happen to me, which I think a lot happens to a lot of people, they go into utopian thinking. I want to develop a utopian world, and that's the world I want to live in. But you can't live in that world. Every time you try, you run into bad consequences. But it's very enticing, and there's a whole generation of several generations of young people who've been sold the lie that the utopia is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're striving for that, fighting for that, marching for that. And I heard a message the other day that I thought was so great, where he was saying, the theologians of the Middle Ages recognize, well, maybe it wasn't, it was it's the Serenity Prayer. Apparently there's a thing at the end of the Serenity Prayer that rarely ever gets added. And that the thing that never gets added is, and if I live this way, I will live in reasonable happiness in this world and supreme happiness in the next.
Mm-hmm.
And we've forgotten and tried to bring this supreme happiness into this world. And by doing that, we're living a counterfeit life. And that usually requires counterfeit ways of happiness, like addictions, idolatry of one kind or another. You're silent. I
My
said
brain
to
is going off in all sorts of directions.
just pick one.
So, well, I'll complete the thought from before. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that a lot of people on the Christian side are afraid of science as well, because it challenges them. And that's one of the issues that I've always kind of lived with being in physics, is that I looked at the Old Testament, and there's so much in the Old Testament, especially the silly rules, that actually have a lot of practical value. And this is one of my first, inklings of this journey. It happened 30 years ago, was bringing this up and having people come back and say, no, if it's practical, it can't be spiritual. And I've actually encountered Christians that said that the laws are there to be obeyed, regardless of whether they make sense or not. That's always put me off, because I looked at things and I say, well, no, there's a reason. If God has a plan for us, you can say, well, it's the predestination view, that we're living a story that's already been written, and our job as humans is to be good characters and play the part that we've been assigned. Then in that sense, maybe the laws are just there for us to obey regardless, not to question. If you take the alternate view that we are co-creators with God, that he wants us as partners in his creative effort, then being able to question and think about things. In that sense, the rules then are practical. The rules are there to help us be creative, to guide us, as virtues, to live a life that helps us be creative. So, the commandment is not that.
That's a missing piece for me. Thank you so much, because that fits right into that, slots right into that idea that constraints are essential for creativity. And those rules are types of constraints. They're limitations that are put onto us to give us the opportunity for more creativity.
Yeah, I like the word discipline more than constraint.
Okay.
That if you want to get good as an athlete, you want to get good as a piano player, you discipline yourself to work. There's certain disciplines that it's not, practicing the piano is not punishment. it's not a constraint. It's an invitation to go forward, but we have to practice our skills. And sometimes,
Well, okay, but there's another use of the word constraint. One of
yeah,
the verses that struck me so strongly when I was a new Christian, and I can't remember where it is or even how exactly how it goes, but I remember the feeling of it, that there's one verse that talks about having your ear pierced, having your ear nailed to the wall, so to speak, because
mhm,
that was a ritual that slaves that had decided to be slaves for life out of a voluntary love of their master went through this ritual of having their ear pierced by an awl, AWL, that
mhm,
it's like a big nail. You
yeah.
know?
I'm old enough
Yeah.
to
Okay.
remember the word.
So that is a voluntary restraint, right? That is putting yourself under the strongest of constraints out of love and out of trust that that's going to be the best for you. And so that when I use the word constraint, that's what I mean. I don't
Yeah,
mean that somebody else put handcuffs on me to
I
prevent.
know.
So maybe I need to find a new word.
No, you're fine. It's just, people use words differently. And I make the mistake of saying things and assuming people will understand what I've said. And then I'll get an answer back like, how did you get that out of what I just said? So
Uh-huh.
I'm always a little bit cautious
Well, no,
about
but
my
I don't think,
definitions.
but see, that's the lovely thing about having conversations is we don't have to be cautious because we can just clarify with each other.
Yeah, I just bounce back and forth.
Yeah. Because because you brought that up, it made me remember that verse, and it also made me aware that I need to use language in a way that's accessible to other people, not just what's inside my head, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's a very good help to me. Thank you so much.
So I'm inclined to go clarify with some examples that on the Ten Commandments. One of the first things that struck me was I always was told, "Thou shalt not lie." And when I looked at it and thought about it, it doesn't say, "Thou shalt not lie." It says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." And if you think in terms of collective or distributed intelligence, when you put false information into the the communal pool of data, you've polluted the well, and now no one can make reliable decisions independently of each other because they can't trust the shared um,
Mm, wow.
world of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the things we've seen with the COVID and the science thing, or the global warming, that false information has been put into the system. So people no longer trust anything. And then they go off on conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Yep.
But that's the natural thing to do. If someone's not being honest with you and you start to wonder why, it's very easy to go off in a crazy direction. So part of developing a trust network is having a society where you can trust what different people say and that the information is complete. And part of the maturity of doing science is that you understand you never know everything completely. There's always exceptions. There's always more to learn. So it's, and we don't appreciate that. Um, Wealth accumulation, societies where families are perpetually in poverty will never be creative. Like they say, it's hard to sing and dance and praise the Lord if you're sick, you're hungry, or you don't worry about life. So part of being able to have a spiritual life is a certain amount of health and wealth. And so a lot of the Ten Commandments are related to that. If you think of the world 3,000 years ago, when the family was the social safety net, then a lot of the rules are preservation of the family and trusting your neighbor. So if you live in a society where you can trust a stranger because they're also Jewish or Christian, that's a society where trust networks can grow very large. when I grew up, a man's handshake was considered a contract.
Mm-hmm.
And that can only happen in a world where people are guided by a moral compass inside. Now the lawyers rule the day.
Well, that's what always struck me. I started thinking about this many years ago when you'd be walking down the street and some store would be having some things on sale. And so they'd put a rack out on the street with a bunch of clothes hanging on it and a price. Anybody could come along and take anything, but because we trust that they're not going to do that, that they're going to pick things up, bring it inside, pay for it, then it'll still work.
Mhm.
If we get to a place where people come along and scoop that stuff up and run off, which we're pretty much there. I mean,
Mhm.
a couple of years ago, you know how the Apple stores have these great big glass walls. A couple of years ago, some crew of thieves in a truck rammed right into the front of the Apple store in Palo Alto, broke through the glass,
Mhm.
ran in, scooped up everything they could get, and then ran out again. And Apple had enough trust that when they rebuilt, they still put the glass walls up.
Yeah.
But then they put those barrier things out in front, to keep the truck out. And that's what Washington is now. Washington, last time I was in Washington, D.C., every single building has those big, I don't know what they call those things, those big,
Bollards?
maybe it's something that it's a big, like cut off pillar that can either sink down into the ground or be pushed back up to create a barrier so that trucks can't be filled with explosives and run in and, whatever. We're losing trust in our culture super fast. And, how much longer do we have? I don't know. But you had mentioned before that you thought this was exactly why Jordan Peterson drew that line in the sand at Bill C-16,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Because if not only other people are voluntarily putting lies into the stream, if we are coerced into putting lies into the stream, then it's over.
Right. And then this gets into another kind of funny area, arguments from stability. And this is another reason why you can't have a perfectly rational morality code. And this actually goes back to Richard Dawkins, believe it or not. It's the first place I ran across this. He talked about nature always chooses stability, not efficiency. And so it's always the most stable scenario which will evolve, not the most efficient or most desirable. And one of his examples in the later half of the book, when he's talking about memes, was you imagine a society which everyone tells the truth all the time. Then you can trust that what someone has told you is the truth. And he said that would be a perfectly wonderful society, creative, wealthy. But he said all it takes is one person who's willing to lie in a society like that, and you can collapse the whole thing in one day. So over time we've evolved a world where most people tell the truth, but there's always a few people who, for one reason or another, will be liars. And so that creates a skepticism. In other words, it inoculates us as a society towards lying. And we see the same pattern in vaccines or a lot of things, that zero exposure to something, we actually become more vulnerable, but small but exposures to elements create a defense network. So if you play that game, you can think about a system of morals based on rational thinking, which is the libertarian view. It sounds wonderful, but all it takes is one person to put a gun to your head and say, if you don't do what I tell you, then you're done. All of a sudden, all your rational principles go out the window. And so a rational society is unstable in the presence of violence or threats of violence. And this is, again, one of my Aspie trips through Associationville. I was thinking about the movie St. Paul. Paul, what was a while back. I think Jim Caviezel was in it. He played the part of Luke. And I was thinking of the world of Rome, where violence and threats of violence was how the government controlled people. And one of the things that the Christians had that made them immune to that is they had a faith in a transcendence. And that allowed them to say no to the threats of violence. And this is one of those aha moments that crucifixion was one of the worst things the Romans could do to a person. The Christians, their savior had been crucified. So how could people who believed, worshiped a savior who had gone through that, say no to the same fate? So Christ's death on the cross inoculated people in some sense against that element of fear and allowed them to move on. And once I got that, I said, yeah, Jesus had to die on the cross. That's the only way it would have worked, because it was through that he broke that chain or that hold of fear on people so they could finally say no to the Romans. And that's when you start to see a truly open and rational society emerge. So yeah, you can't have a rational world unless you have people who believe in a transcendent strongly enough that they're willing to sacrifice their lives to it. Short of that, you'll end up with a world like the Soviet Union, where everything was ruled by fear and everyone would turn their neighbor in for imagined infractions just for the sake of being left alone by the government. So yeah, you can contrast the world of Stalin with the world of the Christians, and you see what the difference between a faith in a crucified savior does for you. Anyway, that's an interesting take I've never heard before.
Yeah, and when you started with that, you said one person lying can sort of inoculate the system and produce a natural skepticism in people to protect them from lying.
Mhm.
And when you said that, I immediately jumped in my head to Solzhenitsyn's comment that one person telling the truth can bring down a tyranny.
Mhm.
And then you kept going and you brought the thread all the way out so beautifully to Christ's death, inoculating them from the fear of death so that they also could face crucifixion voluntarily. And then it ties into Solzhenitsyn saying one person speaking the truth can bring down a tyranny, because one person who's willing to speak the truth and take the consequences is voluntarily putting themselves in a position basically of being crucified.
Mhm.
And then that says to other people, if they are willing to do that, I will come alongside. And that makes me think about something that you and I were emailing when we were, let's bring this back to the beginning of the conversation when
Yeah.
we were emailing back and forth about some YouTubers are using Jordan Peterson as a football for their own, how many hits they're going to get and everything.
Yeah.
By either some pastors are saying, oh, well, he needs Christ and we need to witness to him, or some others are, arguing about him not being a Christian, and some others are arguing, so this whole thing is going on, and poor Jordan Peterson's just trying to live his life and do his thing. And I had made the comment to you based kind of, I think what I was doing was synthesizing what you and I had been talking about. And this is what I said in that email. Yes, he sees a reality that we can only dimly perceive. I'm very frustrated with the pastors that get on YouTube and use their concern for him for clickbait. Everyone has a path that they must travel, for that is how we are prepared for the works designed for us before the world began. My mama heart just wants to relieve the suffering, but I know deep down that that is a toxic thing to do, for how do I know what he must experience to complete his path? And then you came back with this beautiful comment. Yes, but how about we come alongside him and bear part of the load? And I thought, yeah, that's it, man. that's why we all have to speak the truth, because we all have to bear the consequences of that. And
Yeah. But sometimes being able to speak the truth is a path in life that you have to start on when you're young. Right now, we're facing a situation where my wife has to get a vaccine because she teaches, and they require, you know,
mm-hmm,
are hinting very strongly that she better get the vaccine. But
mm-hmm.
it might be okay, it might not. I'm kind of in the C16 bill kind of category. I think it's dangerous to set a precedent where the government can force you to do things like this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what my downstream worry is. But our family, health insurance, everything is tied to her job. So
Mm-hmm.
she's not really in a position to say no.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes being able to say no is a path you start early. You live a life so that you're not, your future, your retirement, your everything is not tied to some agency that could pull it all away in a second. I think that's what's corrupted a lot of our institutions in recent generations. Is people's their pensions and everything.
I wasn't so sure about the vaccine, but my husband said, I want you to get the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
So I did, because he wanted me to get the vaccine. And that because he'd been reading different things that indicated to him that if I didn't get the vaccine, I wouldn't be safe. Now, I have my own questions about it. I have my own questions about whether it's safe. I have my own questions about whether it's effective. I guess we'll find out. I've had the vaccine.
Yeah.
We'll find out whether I get sick or not. But a lot of people have different reasons for whatever path they choose on that. And I think we're going to have to give each other a lot of grace on that thing.
Yeah.
It makes me think of, Jordan Peterson also said that he got the vaccine when he was having a conversation with somebody about it. And he had his reasons. He also had questions in his mind, but he also had his reasons. But it also reminded me of when he first got on and did his very first video about C16, he went into great detail about how other things had come and gone that were nearly as bad, but he had not chosen that as a hill to die on. But on this hill, he would choose this hill to die on. So I guess in a sense, you could say if someone's forcing you to take the vaccine, they're forcing you to speak a truth, to speak a lie into the world. But, maybe not. Maybe that's in a different category. Because we've always had this thing where if you want to travel overseas, you have to get vaccinated for certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the old days, when not so much anymore, but when I was younger, when I was like 20, you had to get vaccinated for 5, 6, 7, 8 things before you could go to some foreign countries. Nowadays, they don't even talk about that because those foreign countries have kind of cleaned up their act. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. That's a tough one as a question about truth. But it is a very excellent example of an acted out truth. And it's also a very excellent example of a truth that has many connections out into everything in reality. The whole idea of being inoculated, the whole idea of being protected, the whole idea of something coming into you and overtaking your system, vaccination has a lot of threads hooked onto it as a concept laden, let's put it that way.
Yeah, it shows up a lot of places in life. Years ago, there was a radon study. I don't know if you remember the 80s. I think it was when the big issue with radon gas and
was
they
that
did a
real
very.
Or was that a scam?
No, it was actually well, it turned into a scam. But they were noticing that people who lived in certain areas of the United States, which I guess certain levels of granite or something underneath, it could accumulate radon gas because radon's a heavier gas in the basements. And so they were doing correlation studies versus lung cancer and stuff like that. And so there was a slight correlation between radon gas accumulation in basements versus people with lung cancer down the road. But what they also found out in the process is that the people who had zero exposure to radon had elevated levels of lung cancer as well. And there was actually kind of a sweet spot where small amounts of exposure actually led to the lowest incidence of lung cancer. Some of the secondhand smoke studies actually have found the same thing, that mild exposure to secondhand smoke actually inoculates people down the road. And so a lot of the secondhand smoke studies were suspect in that sense, that they threw out the data that didn't conform with the conclusions that they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
But if you looked at, again, statistics,
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to do statistics, then you take everything you get. You don't get to parse it out and say, well, that's an odd one. We'll throw that one out because it can't possibly be right. No, you hang on to it all.
That's what Scott Adams always says, that models are useless because models are always developed through choosing what you want to put into the model. Even if it's just unconscious, I mean, that's what I think a lot of scientists don't realize when they think that science is perfectly rational. You're a human being, so you come into it with your unconscious biases, and you're going to choose a scientific thread that interests you, and you're going to develop an experiment that interests you, and it's all connected to you.
Yeah, I've had the direct experience of faculty who was an environmentalist hired gun. He literally produced whatever people paid him to, regardless of the science. And so I've seen it firsthand. So I don't trust a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm much more skeptical of so-called studies that are produced to justify government actions, because a lot of times they're manufactured, and honest to God, there's professors, they have their PhDs and they have their experience, but they will do whatever it takes to get the paycheck.
Yeah, and it was peer reviewed, so it must be real.
No, actually, a lot of the studies that the government bases their regulations on are never peer reviewed. That's one of the funny things, that, well, if it's science, it better be peer reviewed. Well, a lot of it isn't.
Well, I mean, I don't think Einstein was peer reviewed in the beginning. I mean, if he had to be peer reviewed to get his idea out there in the very beginning, wasn't he highly controversial when he first came up with the idea of general relativity?
Okay, I'm getting out of my historical expertise, but I don't think that in his day that the peer review process was what it is like today.
I don't think
so. He published.
They didn't have a peer review process then, but if they had had it, would he have been published at the beginning?
Probably not.
Yeah.
Because he was not in academia at the time. He published the 4 or 5 papers in the space of about a year, and every single one of them was groundbreaking.
Yeah. And very much outside the perimeter of this step-by-step analytical approach to making progress.
Well, that's the joke now, and it's actually not a joke, that if a physicist wants to pursue foundational questions, if they're lucky, they'll get a tenure track position in either the philosophy department or the math department. But people who are interested in foundational questions will never get a tenure track in a physics department.
I guess that's why we've never heard anything more from Nima Arkani Hamed about the morality of truth.
Yeah, he has a strong enough reputation that he could play that game. Lesser physicists could never have done that lecture and gotten away with it.
Well, he only did the one lecture, though. I mean, I haven't seen any other lectures by him about that.
Yeah, most
that one only has a few views.
I know.
No?
Most of his lectures, even a grad student will have to struggle to get through. So yeah, he's probably not the most popular lecturer. But his area of research is sort of dried up. The whole area of string theory, black hole, entropy, emergent space time, a lot of that stuff has really hit a dead end in physics the last decade or so. And he tied his, his fortune to that horse or that star, however this thing goes. So that side of physics is stuck, and everyone's kind of sitting around waiting for what the next new thing. But I doubt
Okay,
it will come
so
out.
when you say it's stuck and that hit a dead end, are you meaning to infer that it's all been seen to be wrong, or are you just meaning to infer that they can't go any farther until they have another breakthrough?
Right. The theories as we have, like the standard model, they're so good. I mean, you can take the theoretical and calculate numbers to 5, 6, 8 places, I don't know, decimal places, and do the experiments, and it's nailed right on. So the model is comprehensive. It took decades to build. It gives incredibly accurate answers, but there are places where it's not right. The experiments are not matching the theory. So something has to be new and different. There has to be something else out there. But the theory is so comprehensive and so fits together so perfectly that no one knows where the next thing is going to come from. And so I think Nima talked about, you have a hill, and then there's the next hill up, but then you have to go down to a valley and up. And so that's where physics is stuck. They're working on the edges. They're fine tuning. They're adding parameters. They're, trying fixes to the old model, and it's not working. But
well, it's because they're not willing to go down in the valley again. Nobody likes the valley. That's where the suffering is, right?
Yeah, it's the valley of no grants.
You can't get to the next mountain.
No grants, no publications.
Yeah.
No one wants to talk to you. So that's where we're at. I think Nima's stuck on that side. And no one knows what the next thing is. And that's what's intriguing. Which brings up one of your emails, which you've been talking about constructor theory.
Mm-hmm.
So we can really take this conversation off. I've been reading up on that for your, but that could be a conversation for another day. But that's the constructor theory as it is, I would not pay attention to, but it's an effort towards putting physics on an axiomatic foundation the same way math is. And I think that's really intriguing, that possibility. So it's something to watch for in the future. And then you mentioned.
So tell me more about that. I mean, does that, to put it on an axiomatic basis, would that be, who was the guy that Gödel was responding to that was trying to make math completely?
That was
complete system.
Russell and Whitehead, Bertrand Russell and Hilbert.
No, there was some other guy that was
Hilbert before.
Yes, that was saying that math could be this complete system and everything would be completely consistent within it. And Gödel came along and said, well, no, everything has to have something outside of it that refers, so. Yeah,
and then Alan Turing took Gödel's line of thinking, applied it to theory of computation. And then you can show there's things that are uncomputable, that there's things that an algorithmic process can never give an answer to. So even the world of computation shares that incompleteness. The question is,
so when you say constructor theory is an effort to put physics on an axiomatic basis, would that be similar to what Hilbert was trying to do with math, or more?
I think, that's my take on it. I don't think David Deutsch, who's it's his little baby. What he's trying to do doesn't always make sense to me, but what I'm sensing is that's what he wants to be doing, but he's not a mathematician, so he's trying to use the tools of a physicist. But he's asking that basic question is you go beyond the laws of physics, F equals ma and that stuff, and ask, well, what can be done? What is possible? What isn't possible? And trying to cast a theory of what is possible and what isn't possible. What makes something physically predictable? There's those questions underlying all of his thinking. And what I'm suspecting he's trying to do is he wants to do for physics what Gödel did for math, to create a system where you could say, this is provable, this is not provable, but yet it is consistent with laws of physics. And if that effort ever pans out, that would be a major step. But he's poking at it, he's getting close, but I'm not satisfied that he's on the right track. But that's just my
One of
opinion.
the problems for me in listening to him is that his language is very imprecise.
Yeah.
And so it comes off, it can sound almost as though he's trying to sound profound. He probably is being profound, but his language is so imprecise that you can't quite follow what he's trying to say, which is one of the reasons that I liked his, the woman that works with him. What's her name? Charletto?
Yeah.
Something.
Okay.
She is a little bit more precise in her language, so she's a little easier for me to understand. But even when she's talking about it, it doesn't really sound. It sounds as though they don't have anything yet, but they're trying to sound as though they do have something.
Exactly. Yeah. I pulled up some of their papers that I could find on the internet and tried to read through them, and it's frustrating because the math isn't there. I find that that physics refrain, just shut up and do the math. So, it's like, okay, stop talking about it. Stop telling me what you want to do or trying to do. Just, give me a few lines there of math.
Well, when Gödel did that for math, did he have the math, or was he just?
Yes, he had the math. Yeah.
Gödel had the math. Okay.
So the mathematical foundation that Gödel was able to launch from is not there for physics. So
well, could Deutsch get together with Wolfram? Because in Wolfram's theory of everything, he talks about what is computationally irreducible and then what is computationally reducible. And he says, to me, it was kind of a miracle, actually, that there is this layer of computational reducibility, because that's the only thing that allows us to, as in our finite humanness, to be able to make any sense of it at all. Because there is this, if everything was computationally irreducible, we would be, we wouldn't be able to handle it at all. But there's only this thin layer of computational reducibility.
So the question is there something beyond what is reducible, which is still true? And Gödel said, yes, there is, as far as math goes. And I think, I believe in physics, there'll be the same thing, that there are things that are physically allowed, but are not computationally derivable, starting from first principles. But that's an open question. We'll see in the future how it goes.
So allowed, but not derivable from first principles.
Mm-hmm.
And you think that's what Deutsch is working on?
Well, that's what I keep picking up, if I have a spidey physics sense. I'm reading his words and I'm trying to, okay, what are you trying to say? And one of the games I've always played when I try to understand something is imagine I'm at the whiteboard or the chalkboard and I'm trying to explain it to somebody else. So I keep rereading it over and over again. Okay, what are you trying to say? How would I say this to somebody else? And if I imagine trying to lecture somebody on what David Deutsch was talking about, that's how it starts to come out in a more axiomatic, mathematical sense. Mm-hmm. And so that's the structure I feel is trying to emerge underneath his theories, but it hasn't formed yet.
Oh, I wish I could get the two of you talking to each other.
No. That's one of the things that going to grad school is like, okay, I'm smart. But when I get there, I'm with people who are like really smart, and it just, I had one instructor, that I wanted to do a thesis work, and I sat it and I took some seminar classes with him, and it's just like watching this plane fly over at 35,000 feet, and you just go, okay, yeah, I know why you're here, and I'm not worthy. So David Deutsch is one of those people who's way up there. So no, I wouldn't.
Well, but sometimes even those people just need to have the right question, you know?
Mhm.
If it weren't for the rest of us dummies down here, maybe they wouldn't get at the questions that are necessary, you
Yeah.
know? So,
Well, sometimes in order to call somebody on their craziness, you have to be at the same level. You know, it's this the story of the emperor has no clothes. You know,
yeah.
it's the little kid in the audience, the nobody is the one who was able to point it out. But in general, professionally, um, that doesn't happen.
Well, but you know, I don't think there's a necessity to point out the weakness in someone's theory to just ask a question,
Yeah.
right?
Well, if I was 30 years younger, yeah, I would probably try and do it. I'd probably write a paper, but I'm not. So I have enough energy to putz around the house with a few things here and there, and that's
Well,
it.
if you think of what a good question would be, maybe I'll try to get that chart to let whatever her name is on the show, and I'll ask her the question. I think I could have a good conversation with her.
Mhm.
Imara, well, I can't remember.
It's a C and an M.
Yeah,
It's words. It's Italian, and I can't pronounce it, so I have a hard time remembering it.
yeah, yeah. But she's got a very sharp mind, a sharp way of looking at things. So that's constructor theory. I don't have to keep going down that road anymore because I kind of have a picture of what you're saying right now, that he's trying to do for physics what Gödel did for math.
Mhm.
So that's a good frame for me to have.
It's I would look at it as baking bread and forgetting to put the yeast in. You know, there's something there to pay attention to, but it's missing something still. So,
Hmm.
and then last but not least, you talked about boundaries and inside and outside in
Oh
your
yes, I
email.
want you to remind me again. Give me again your framework for inside and outside, because I've been thinking about it so long and I've translated it into so many other realms. And I think I may be doing that incorrectly, but I think it's like super important, the inside outside thing.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe a different way to express it. Um, if you're trying to build something up that's complicated, um, this is a story. You know, when I was growing up, my dad was an electronics technician and for the Air Force, and he used to repair radios and TVs and things like that at home just to bring in some extra money. So I remember even as a little kid sitting there at the kitchen table watching him work on some of this stuff. And I don't know if you remember the old vacuum tube TVs. I mean, it was
I
just a
do.
rat's nest of wires inside.
Indeed, I do.
And it's one of the few memories I have when I was little. And I remember asking him how he knew where everything went. And he answered me, um, complicated things are just a bunch of simple things put together. If you understand how each one of the parts of the circuit works, then the whole big picture is easy. And so that's how, when I started electronics, I always, you study the individual circuits, you know, the IF amp, and you know how the individual tube or the circuit works. And then when you step back and you look at that rat's nest of wires, you don't see that rat's nest. What you see is a block diagram of, of, of IF amp, you know, audio, horizontal. And so all of a sudden it simplifies into this simpler block diagram. So all of the complicated circuit messes have now just become a block, you know, on a diagram with a little title with some input output wires. So I'm saying that's a good example of inside outside. Once you step outside, things become simple. The complexity is hidden from you now. And so you can deal with whatever it is inside by only a handful of factors. So to understand a big complicated thing now, if you layer it in layers of complexity, each layer or each boundary hides that complexity to the next layer up. So inside becomes a simplified view, I mean, outside, and it lets you deal with complexity in a simple way. And I used to think, well, if I was God and I was making a universe where life could exist and all sorts of these crazy things. One of the first challenges is how do you deal with that combinatoric explosion problem that tends to be, I think, the main element of any argument against evolution by accident. Is there's just too many possibilities. The odds against everything randomly coming together are astronomically against it. But if you could layer life, if you could layer how the universe works so that it comes up and then there's a boundary and the complexity becomes hidden, and that becomes a simple object which now can be manipulated at a next level. And so that you can sort of short circuit that combinatoric explosion and allow complicated things to emerge. And so that's what I'm thinking in terms of inside, outside, and boundary, is that hiding of complexity. Does that make any sense or help?
Well, yeah, and the reason it came up for me is that I've been reading a book that Michael wanted me to read called Speaker's Meaning by Owen Barfield. Mm-hmm. And Barfield is talking about the evolution of language as a marker or a signifier to us of the evolution of consciousness over time. And in the beginning of the book, he starts talking about history from a historian's viewpoint, and how there's this one historian named Collingwood that had a particular theory. Barfield's not owning up to whether he agrees with the theory or not, because he says he's going to visit again later in the book, but he just lays out the idea. And here's the idea, that history has an inside and an outside, particularly through the historian's lens. And the outside would be the bodies that move around and in the events that happen. Mm-hmm. Cesar crossed the Rubicon.
Yeah.
Later, he was killed on the floor of the Senate. Those things happen, okay? The bodies are moving. But the inside is the political turmoil that was happening at the time and the thought processes that people were going through and all of that. Mm-hmm. Now, does that line up with the inside outside the way you're thinking about it? Because I sort of simplified that down to the inside being the why and the outside being the what.
I could go with that. Yeah, because the historians are dealing with an outline view, a block diagram view of what happened. Mm-hmm. Individual events, crossing the Rubicon, there was an army, there was cows and horses and, a huge thing. All of the politics, the personal and the political, all that contributes to the big picture. But if you want to understand the big picture, then you just look at the highlights. Maybe that's the peaks of the mountains. But that's how we do a lot of things, I think. So yeah, I would agree that that's a way to use the inside-outside terms.
Okay. Because I am in getting ready for my presentation to the Wisdom Path Colloquium, I put together a list of aspects, I'm not sure what to call them, factors that are significant to me in the way that the world works. And each one kind of feeds into the next one. So inside outside is kind of the first layer. And then this next layer would be boundaries. Mm-hmm. Because there is an inside and an outside, there has to be a boundary between them, right? And then without boundaries, there can be no being, because the thing cannot exist without a boundary that you can get outside of. And then that leads to the need for simplification, because the inside is so complex. The only way it can be dealt with is from the outside. I mean, this is the whole Gödel thing too, right? Be dealt with from the outside, because the combinatorial explosion makes the forward movement impossible without an aim that can simplify the path. So you get outside, you're looking at it from this simplified version, which then points up that necessarily the way things are constructed is unity and multiplicity. right? Because there has to be the one and the many for this
Mhm.
inside outside boundary simplification kind of thing to even be a thing.
And then the many come together and form a new unity, which then
Yeah,
starts the process over again.
yes, and the unity and multiplicity are dwelling in relationship. And then dominance is a very important aspect of this whole thing, but it's the character, it's the quality of dominance that's important. And here I'm going to try to break this out a little bit. I think you have a few minutes yet.
Oh yeah, I've got all morning.
Okay. Whenever you hear the word dominance, people immediately start to think, oh, the patriarchy, dominance of the patriarchy, and the dominance of this group or that group. But that's not the sense in which an artist thinks of dominance. An artist thinks of dominance in terms of, in order for the painting to hold together, something has to be dominant. Actually, in all of the different elements, you could have a dominance. Every element could have a aspect of it which is dominant, but then it would start getting very complicated. So maybe you simplify it down and just think of a dominance of value. Value is dark to light. It's a gradation of dark to light. Every painting, in order to be successful, needs to have a dominance of either dark or light. If you break it down half, it's never a very successful painting. Just a second.
Yeah, I'm getting allergies.
Is that what it is? Yeah,
Well, for me it is.
I'm feeling it. So the way dominance works is, my teacher used to call it Papa, Mama, Baby. You have roughly 80% of, let's say, a mid-tone, and 15% dark and 5% light. That light area becomes the focal point because it's the smallest. So the focal point is where your eye wants to go when you look at the painting. And of course, there's a lot of other stuff going on here. The successful painting takes you on a journey through the painting rather than just zap right onto that focal point. But
I like that analogy.
yeah. So the dominance is there to provide a background or a support to the focal point, not to dominate the painting. It's there to provide a support. So it's self-sacrificing in a sense. But it's the dominance that brings the painting into unity. Because if you don't have anything that's dominant and everything is just a bunch of equal sized shapes, it starts looking like wallpaper. You've seen wallpaper that might even be beautifully designed wallpaper, but it's obviously wallpaper. It's not a unique work of art. So dominance brings about the unity. So after dominance, then comes anomaly, because in many ways, the focal point is the anomaly in the painting. It's the thing that sticks out. It doesn't fit into the background like everything else does. And it's the anomaly. In my worldview, the anomaly is not only the obstacles and the struggles and the mountains that we face and the suffering and all of that, but that anomaly is a gift because it's the anomaly that produces the growth. And that's as far as I've gotten with my whole thing. Oh, wait, the simplify. Once we get into simplifying, that comes down to the whole thing of seeing. And seeing is what kind of focus that you're using when you look at something, where the artistic view tends to be very holistic and try to see the whole picture in order to recreate its essence rather than zoning in on all the particulars. I mean, it doesn't really matter what each eyelash looks like. What matters is whether or not the face is exhibiting the character or the quality that you want it to exhibit, right? So you're looking at the whole rather than the particular. That's as far as I got anyway.
Oh.
But
Yeah, that's one of the odd things about paintings that tell us about how our minds work, is that if you look closely at a lot of the portraits, like, you know, the classics, at a close level, it's not a photograph, but you step back a little bit and somehow they've actually captured the life. You can actually see a real live person there. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Oh yeah,
So,
exactly. And I never could figure out how they do that. When you're up close, it's just a bunch of dribs and drabs, and you step back, you can see these perfect pearls around her neck and this perfect lace and the velvet fabric. You can see it. It's just like a photograph.
yeah.
You come up close and it's just brushstrokes.
Yeah. Or the expressions on the faces, and well, in some of the better artists, yeah, you can see the life there, and it's like, wow, how did you capture that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you say, okay, that's why you're a master. That's why your painting's still hanging.
Yes, and that's why, like Jordan Peterson said, that's why people will go and stand there for hours and just gaze at it, right? But I think all of these things relate to everything else in the world, in the universe. And the reason that I think that's so goes back to Jordan Peterson's whole thing about he talks about the important thing being the process that captures meaning out of chaos and turns it into order. And he used to talk about this process that sort of rides the wave between chaos and order, with one foot in chaos, 1 foot in order and 1 foot in chaos, so that voluntarily can go into chaos, find the treasures there and bring them back. And then there's also times you just fall over into chaos and you don't have a stable hold on order anymore, but you still have to attend to what's going on there to see what you can find that will help you to come back and bring the order back to the society. So he calls that a process, but then later in that video that I sent you, he actually is talking about truth. Truth is that process that helps you turn chaos into order. And so that, in my mind, that process is the process of creativity. I mean, it absolutely lines up all the way down the road, that it's creativity that turns chaos into order. And creativity has a shape, and the shape of creativity is these things that I just said are kind of not governors, but observations about how, or their maybe voluntary constraints, although I hesitate to use that word now. I'll find a better word.
No, that's fine.
That encircle creativity, but then the elements and principles of creativity are these things that have this polarity, like gradation goes all the way from you could have a gradation of a color that would go all the way from the very palest pink all the way to the most intense red, or you could have a gradation of that goes all the way from white all the way to black, goes through every shade of gray. You can have a gradation of line that goes from very thin to very thick. You have a gradation of size that goes from infinitesimal to very large. So gradation is one of those principles. Repetition is a principle, and we see repetition all through creation, right? Non-identical and identical repetition going on everywhere. So all these principles kind of create, I'm trying to think of the right word, but it's kind of like a web, an interlocking web, or maybe we would dare to say fundamental waves or something like that, that are moving through the universe, that are just the way everything is put together. It's just a picture of the way everything is put together, but I haven't found a good way to describe it yet. So that's what I'm working on.
Well, I had a couple of thoughts that took off while you were talking, and
did I make you lose them?
I was struggling to hold on. It's on the creative process, pulling, order out of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, that fundamental question is are things discovered or do we invent them?
Mm-hmm.
I've asked that, is math invented or discovered? You could ask that, is music invented or discovered? Is your art invented or discovered? If we're discovering things, then the truth is somehow that discipline that allows us to look and see where the patterns are showing up. Then that's how we can discover it and pull it back
Mm-hmm.
out of chaos. So
Mm-hmm.
that's just a thread. I'm not sure where it goes.
Well, I think that's a perfect description of meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you see where the patterns are showing up and you're able to bring that back and
Mm-hmm.
turn it into order, that is a perfect description of meaning,
So
which is a
part
perfect
of
description of reality and truth and all those things.
so part of the creative process is being able to recognize or sense it, not even intellectually recognize, but feel, okay, there's something out there. There's something I need to hold on, need to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's like, okay, Glenn, go back, look again. You're missing something. I don't understand. It doesn't make sense. Go back, look again. You're missing something. So what is it emotionally that grabs me, that tells me that there's something out there I need to keep going with, that, I'm not a crazy, person. And I think somehow some people have the ability to recognize patterns more than others. And out in the world of chaos, there's overlaying patterns that sort of reinforce each other. And the example that comes to mind is from physics is quasi-particles, where you can have a photon, which is a particle of sound, and a photon, which is a particle of light, and a phonon, which is a particle of sound, can actually combine in a crystal lattice to form a composite particle, which then travels through. And so there's a whole range of phenomena in condensed matter where you have different particles combining their nature to form these composite particles that now take on their own existence. They have their own patterns of being. So sometimes I wonder if there are patterns out there in the chaos combined together to form these new composite patterns that somehow we pick up on as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
I love that. So the one that you described, that the photon and the phonon.
phonon, yeah, I think that's what's called an exciton, but I could be wrong. But there's a whole menagerie of quasi particles.
I saw a video one time, and it may have been one of those woo-woo videos, I don't know, or it may have been a real one. I can't even remember anymore, but it was talking about the music of the spheres, and that there actually is that there is a sound to the motions of the planets and the stars and the galaxies. And I wonder if that is these photons that are actually connected to phonons, so that the light
No,
exhibited. You don't
in
think?
physics, it only happens in a crystal lattice solid. So there has to be some medium where both of the particles exist, and then the medium that they both exist in allows them to combine and interact with each other.
And then is there an actual sound there, or has the sound disappeared?
I wouldn't use those terms at all at that level. No, a particle of sound is not anything like you imagine.
Okay.
I just do the math, I don't try and
Okay.
imagine what these things are for real, because you can just
Can't do
go
the math.
crazy.
You have to do the math for me. Yeah.
So I think I've covered everything that were in the emails we've had recently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was great. And it very much helped me to realize where the holes are in my thinking and what I have to tighten up in terms of vocabulary to make the ideas more understandable.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad to hear that I'm not completely crazy thinking that truth and reality are the same thing.
Well, I think that's a good, if you don't want to be religious or spiritual, I think replace God with capital T truth. And I think you'll end up getting to the same place eventually. I think that's one of the,
But he himself said that he was capital T
I
truth.
know that I would make the stronger statement that Jesus is the truth. He is the manifestation of truth. So truth in all of its forms, not just one.
Yes. Well, and the actual verse in John 14:6, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. If you look up that word truth in Greek, the actual definition of that Greek word is reality.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure why they translated it truth, but it actually is reality.
Yeah. Well, you can try replace no one comes to the Father but by me. Replace the Father with reality. No one gets to know reality except through the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And you can try that word substitution and see how it works. But I think it all comes down to the same thing at some point. There's something bigger than us out there, and it's drawing us forward. And the only way we can get there or close to it is by being completely, utterly truthful with ourselves and those around us.
Well, and I was reminded the other day in a conversation that won't publish until next week about confession and the role that confession plays in our life. Because whether it's confession that we're doing on our own or confession in a liturgical sense in a church setting, it's the time when we are doing our very best to speak the truth about who we are and what we've done and what, so.
It's a pathway to come to terms with your shadow.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you want to do the Jungian thing.
Yeah. This has been great, Glenn. I always learn so much when I'm talking to you, and I wish I could do the math. I might learn more, but.
Well, I used to be able to, but I can't anymore either, so don't feel bad.
Now you can be a philosopher.
I guess. Yeah, some of that physics is actually very physical. I mean, it takes a lot out of you physically to pursue things at that level. So it's a young person's game.
Yeah. I don't think most people realize how many calories are used when you're actually using your brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Well, I lived on coffee and chocolate frosted donuts in grad school.
Now, no more of that. You have to stay healthy.
No, those days are long gone.
So have a wonderful weekend, and I thank you so much for joining me, and I can't wait till we get together again.
Okay, thank you. Take care.